Welcome to Talking Supply Chain. In each episode, top supply chain industry professionals and the nation's top thought leaders join host Brian Strait and share their unique insights to help supply chain managers stay one step ahead of their competition. This is Talking Supply Chain. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Talking Supply Chain podcast. I'm your host, Brian Strait, and I'm glad you've taken a few minutes to join us for this episode. When hurricanes or other disasters strike, logistics become a lifeline for thousands, and in some cases, even millions of people. And the trucking, logistics, and supply chain industries are always ready to help, often working side by side with organizations like FEMA and the American Red Cross to provide the supplies communities need not only to survive the immediate aftermath of the disaster, but to rebuild. But trucks just don't arrive at the site of a disaster. They're part of a well-coordinated logistical plan, and one of the key organizations involved in these efforts is the American Logistics Aid Network, or ALAN. I'd like to welcome Kathy Fulton, Executive Director of ALAN, to the show. Welcome, Kathy. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be with you.
Great. We're going to get into some practical advice in a bit for organizations that want to get involved and how to help and whatnot. But to get started, can you kind of tell our audience a little bit about who ALAN is, what you guys do today? Because it's not just hurricane relief, even though that's kind of what we're talking about today, right? There's a lot more to what ALAN actually does.
Yeah, there is a lot more to what ALAN does, but let me give a little bit of history and then we can talk about it.
Yeah.
So ALAN we're one of those post-Katrina organizations. So we were actually formed in 2005 when a bunch of supply chain industry leaders were together at a conference and they saw all of the challenges that were happening along the Gulf Coast. Now, chief among those challenges, or I guess among the recognitions, was that the system for providing relief to communities affected by crisis really did not take into account the capabilities of private sector resources. There's just this flaw in it, right? And so all of those industry leaders, saw that as really an opportunity to give back, to use our profession's assets and skills and knowledge to make a difference. And so they created ALAN. Now, really what we do, our reason for existing is to make it easier for businesses to donate their logistics services or equipment. And, we know who the nonprofits are who are responding and doing the good work in an area, but maybe just need a little bit of supply chain assistance. And so we help the nonprofit community to access the generous support of the logistics and supply chain industry professionals.
Yeah. So when it comes to disaster relief, every time we have a big hurricane comes or a tornado strikes, whatever, we always hear about FEMA, right? FEMA and stuff. I think FEMA is the organization we all think about first, right? When it comes to disaster response. So how is ALAN different from FEMA?
Yeah.
And do you guys work alongside them? Is it hand in hand kind of that relationship?
So that's a great question. It's really interesting. Before I got into disaster relief, a long time ago now, FEMA was about the only name that I knew either. FEMA or the Red Cross, you heard about those organizations. But there's really this entire ecosystem of organizations who respond. So let me tell you about the first way in which ALAN is obviously different than FEMA. FEMA is a government organization. We are a nonprofit organization, right?
Yeah.
But the second, it really is this. When there's a disaster, ALAN recognizes that the best way to help communities is by ensuring that the businesses that delivered supplies pre-disaster can continue to do so, right? So we do work alongside FEMA. In one of the ways that we're working alongside them is by helping them understand what's happening with pre-existing supply chains. How are the grocers and retail sector acting? How is transportation acting? So that FEMA can better target where to send their scarce resources and better fill the gaps. So, yeah.
So you joined ALAN in 2010, first serving as a director of operations, and then you took over as executive director in 2014. And reading up on your bio a little bit in preparing for this, I read that your passion is really the intersection of supply chain and emergency management. Correct?
Yeah.
So I know that many people see relief supplies going to sites and they don't understand how they get there. So can you talk a little bit about why this intersection is so important to you and how emergency management and supply chain actually interact with each other?
Yeah, it sounds really geeky when I hear it out loud, but I really
It's not. It's not.
okay, okay. It's true. I really am passionate about this. And it a little bit starts with my history in that I was fortunate to actually volunteer with Alan, or I guess I was really voluntold that I was going to support Alan for a couple of years before I became a loan executive and then following into the position I'm in now. But for me, it's really seeing that whole life cycle and recognizing that it's more than just supplies, right? It's really about these fabulous skills that supply chain professionals use day in and day out to help make profit and applying those same skills to really make a difference for communities. Um, as supply chain professionals, we are dealing with the minor crises every day, right? But we're also long-term thinkers. And so when we have those tactical focus on what is in front of us now skills, we can apply those to the in the moment response things that happen in the middle of a disaster. And then we can use those long-term strategic skills for planning for the next response or thinking about how do we make change, make improvements, mitigate so that the same issues that happen in this disaster don't happen in the next one.
And as you talk about disasters, we've had three hurricanes, I should say. I mean, there's been other disasters this year,
Mhm.
but three hurricanes so far this year, as we're recording the day that we're recording this, that have made landfall in the U.S. So that was Hurricane Beryl in Texas, Hurricane Debby in Florida, and then recently Hurricane Ernesto in the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico.
Mhm.
And the hurricane season isn't even over yet. I mean, we still have a couple months to go here, right? It goes to the end of November.
Yeah.
So when disaster areas, whether they're from hurricanes or tornadoes or flooding, those areas can be chaotic, right? I mean, you have infrastructure problems and whatnot. Can you walk us through kind of the process of how relief supplies get into those areas and what some of the challenges that organizations face like yours to try to get supplies in there, and
Yeah.
then why I think importantly why a specialized organization such as Allen actually is needed to help facilitate all of this.
Yeah, all terrific questions, and chaotic, I think, is an understatement in some of the disasters that we deal with. But really getting relief supplies into a disaster area is actually pretty similar to getting products to a store shelf or to a front doorstep in this world of e-commerce. You have to focus on the demand, right? Focus on getting items to where they're needed. So when you're dealing with a disaster, that delivery process gets complicated by literal roadblocks, down trees or power poles, or, in the case of island deliveries, port shutdowns, things
Yeah.
like that. Um, but there's also all of these figurative roadblocks, like well-intentioned government interventions. Now, we saw a ton of those that happened during COVID, right? Where we had curfews and whatnot. Um, our role really is to help businesses and nonprofits navigate that landscape to figure out how do you get around those hurdles, whether they're physical or figurative. And we do that by like doing our homework and building relationships, and nobody else. There's not another organization out there that's really focused on understanding business and government and nonprofit in the context of logistics and supply chain.
Yeah. And there's a lot of anytime there's a disaster, I mean, there's always organizations wanting to help, right? I mean,
Yes.
and many of them don't think about it prior to the disaster, right? It's they just reacting in the moment, good-hearted, good nature and whatnot. But
Exactly.
it does create chaos. I mean, I've heard stories of truckers just showing up at a site after a tornado went through and just creating chaos because nobody called them there. They just came because they wanted to help.
Yeah,
You know,
please don't do that. If you're listening to this podcast, please don't do that. Call me. We'll give you better ways that you can help.
Yeah. We'll get in. I'll give you a chance to explain a little bit about that process in a bit. But so does Alan, as you work through these things and you help out in these areas, are you raising money for relief supplies? Are you collecting the supplies yourself, or are you guys just providing the logistics services?
So yes, no, and yes, to your questions. But as a 501(c)(3), the bulk of our funding actually comes from corporate and individual donors, right? So we absolutely rely on raising money in order to maintain our operations and ensure we can keep doing the work that we're doing. You asked about collecting supplies. We don't do that, right? We leave that to our nonprofit partners who are actually working in those communities and they're the ones who are best positioned to understand what those communities need after a particular disaster. And then we're working alongside them to help them find the donated logistic services and equipment to ensure that the supplies make it to those communities. But I'll say this, it's more than just making connections for donated services. We really want to help the nonprofit partners throughout the year. We want to equip them with knowledge and expertise, so that they're better shippers, right? That's everybody's goal, is to have these, these perfect shippers. But we want them to be more efficient with their logistics operations, and their supply chain activities, because the more that they're saving on those processes, the more money and time that they can dedicate to serving their communities.
So you're kind of acting like as like the 3PL for the nonprofits, right? And
I'll take
it's
that.
a
Yeah.
is that
Yeah.
kind of correct kind of thing? I mean, you're providing the services. 3PL would traditionally work. Hey, a shipper has goods to move. The 3PL works to find a carrier
Yeah.
to move those goods, right? I mean, you're helping connect those nonprofit organizations, those relief agencies,
Yeah.
and not just, I shouldn't say just nonprofits, because it's also businesses. It's companies that donate supplies and food and water and things like that, right? It's not
Right.
just nonprofits.
Yeah, and we're specifically focused for the activities on helping to move supplies. We're specifically focused on nonprofits. If a business calls us and they have resources to donate, we can help them find partners. We hope that they'll be generous enough to donate that transportation needed to get it to the nonprofit. If for whatever reason they can't, then we'll work with the nonprofit on options.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the important parts when it comes to moving supplies in disaster areas is infrastructure. As you know, a hurricane
Mhm.
comes through, roads can be damaged, power lines are down, there's no electricity, there's no water, there's no food. There's a lot of issues, right, that
Yeah,
exist.
yeah.
Um, but as I was reading out, one of the things that you guys provide is information management as one of the services that you offer. Can you kind of talk about that? What is that what kind of information you're collecting? How do you disseminate that information?
Yeah, so information management sounds a lot sexier than it really is. So I mean it is. We're doing great work in this area, but let me try to explain a little bit about what I mean when we say information management. So we have a couple of different ways that we do this. Working with a group called Everstream Analytics, which is an AI platform. We have a visual tool that we call our Supply Chain Intelligence Center. And our Supply Chain Intelligence Center really allows anyone who logs into it to see the real-time weather conditions at all of the critical pieces of infrastructure that get disrupted, right? So ports and airports and bridges and even truck parking locations are mapped so that whenever you log into this resource, you can see, is it red, is it yellow, is it green, right? To tell you the conditions. And then you can dive deeper and you can see, oh, there's potential for flooding, or there's potential for high winds at this particular location. And it's not just the current conditions, but because it's predictive analytics, there's a 10-day horizon that you can see what's coming. That helps better prepare and plan your supply chains and your activities, right?
Yeah.
But beyond kind of understanding the impacts to physical infrastructure, our information is really also about helping people understand regulatory actions that can cause friction in supply chains, or actions that can actually increase velocity. So on our website, on our disaster microsite, we keep a list of the current government actions for each particular disaster. And so it's things like curfews or hours of service. Well, I guess we would say like hours of service or waivers, right? Things that can amplify flow to a disaster area, or things that can prevent it, like curfews or other restrictions, road closures that are going to prevent resources from flowing. we see this kind of information management as our give back to the industry that supports us, making sure that they have everything that they need to keep their supply chains moving, and it helps our nonprofits as well. So, like I said earlier, we know that the best way to support communities after a disaster is to keep those pre-existing supply chains going. So we want to do everything we can to help with that.
Yep. It doesn't have to be sexy. It has to be effective, right?
Yes. Thank you.
So there
Thank
you
you.
go. There you go. It's important information. It needs to get out there. It needs to be distributed, and somebody needs to collect it and do that work. So
Yeah.
thank you for doing that. Um, the supply chain industry always willing to help out. I know I've learned that over
Mhm.
the years that I've been involved in it. Anytime a disaster comes out, people are willing to help, but the planning for a disaster, right? Or the planning for the response to a disaster, I should say, does not happen when that disaster happens, correct? It happens long
Correct.
before that.
Yeah.
So can you kind of give us some insight as to how you go about developing plans? How far in advance do you develop plans? Is it like a playbook that you follow, or how do you develop plans to respond?
Yeah, so there's a little bit a mix of you know, playbook paired with good improvisational technique. So yes, and is always in our vocabulary. But really, it looks like for us, what it looks like is working year round to shore up our supply chain, right? Making sure that we're meeting with our nonprofits and government partners so we understand what their plans look like, and then meeting with businesses to understand how and when they may be able to uh, how and when they may be willing to help, and what types of information is going to be needed to support all of that. So that helps us better understand, okay, where does Allen fit into this? Um, what, where are the gaps that our particular strengths can help fill? And then where are places where there's opportunities for us to provide education or enlightenment to our nonprofit or government partners. I'll also say we have just these incredible industry associations that we partner with, and we meet with them every 2 weeks. And they help keep us up to speed on what's happening in commercial supply chains. So that really helps us understand, here's what the landscape for the logistics and supply chain environment ecosystem looks like right now. So we can kind of temper and adjust our plans accordingly.
So I would imagine that constant communication is really important. Right? You mentioned every 2 weeks, right?
Yeah,
I mean, the supply chain can change, right? I mean, suddenly you get an influx of of cargo to ports, and you might have a bunch of trucks heading out west, right?
exactly.
And suddenly, if a disaster happens in the southeast, and that capacity you thought you had available might not be there.
Yeah, supply chains are complex adaptive systems, right? And so keeping up to speed by, paying attention to what's in the industry press. Thank you for all that you guys do to keep me informed. But just what's happening in the world. Supply chains react to world events, and you know, it the fact that disasters, our disaster response is dependent on what's happening in supply chains. Supply chains are also going to adjust depending on what happens with disasters. So
Yeah.
it's this lovely ecosystem that we're just very fortunate to be at the center of.
Yeah. So speaking of that ecosystem, that ecosystem is very broad, and you've got the nonprofits on one side, you've got carriers, trucking companies on another. Um, how do you find those organizations? What's that outreach look like? What's the onboarding look like for organizations that want to participate and get involved and offer
Yeah,
their services?
Yeah, so we're super fortunate. I mentioned that we work with all of the logistics and supply chain industry associations. They're often our first point of contact, because they have a trusted relationship with all of the businesses who are their members, right?
Yeah.
For us, it is very much a trust-based environment, right? We're asking people to do something for free, typically, right, in order to support the betterment of mankind. And people aren't going to do that if they don't trust that you're doing the right thing, right? And so we're very mindful of that. So we meet, with all of our partners. You asked about the onboarding process. Super easy. We just need to to have a conversation with any of these organizations. And this is exactly what onboarding looks like. We have a conversation, we talk about what are the parameters in which it makes sense for your business to get involved. What geographies, what time of year, what particular commodities, where and when and how you would like to help. And so that when we catalog all of that information, so we know that when there's a request that is going to fit for your business and your geography, we'll just reach out to you and ask if you can help. Now, that said, we are always working on, the thought that this is an opportunity, not an obligation. We're not committing you to anything because we know, like we just said, businesses change rapidly in response to the environment.
Yeah. You, I was found this story on your website. I want you to, I'd like you to tell this story if you don't mind. It's in your FAQ section on the website, and everybody listening, I would encourage you to go, if you have any interest at all in helping out, go to the FAQ section. There's a lot of great information, and it really kind of details a lot of the things that you need to know about getting involved in Allen. But there was a story about an animal rescue group that reached out to you during the Oregon wildfires in 2017.
Mm.
Can you talk about that request and how you went about trying to fulfill it? And as I understand, I fortunately you didn't have to fulfill it, right? Uh,
Yeah.
but can you?
Oh, Brian, this is like one of those moments, right? When you're like, is this really my life right now? Um, so you're right, it happened in 2017. And if any of you can remember what was happening in 2017, we had Hurricane Harvey along the Gulf Coast and Irma in Florida. And Maria, which devastated Puerto Rico. Then we had wildfires out west, which were really just up and down the coast. And then we got asked by this animal rescue group if we could help them evacuate their animals. It's not something that's typically a fit for us. So we wanted to kind of dive in and understand a little bit more. Well, they said, hey, we're going to need flatbeds and we're going to put the tigers and the lions on in their cages on the flatbeds. And like, it almost went past me. And I'm
Yeah,
like, wait, you're talking lions and tigers?
tigers.
Are there
Eh,
bears here too? Um, so like you said, fortunately, we were able to identify, a provider to do it. Fortunately, the fire shifted, got pushed back enough so that we didn't have to take the animals out of their habitat. But
Yeah,
it's nice to know that, there are people willing to do that should we need them.
yeah. It's interesting. I mean, obviously we focus a lot on the human side of disasters,
Yeah.
obviously, but there are a lot of people out there that pay attention to the animal side and the animal kingdom
Yes.
as
Yeah.
well, and those animals are displaced too. I mean, this is their habitats that are being damaged and whatnot. We just had here. I live in Connecticut, and we just
Yeah.
had some massive rain come through, and there was an animal shelter here. They had to evacuate all the animals because of flooding, and it's damaged their shelter. And
Yeah.
now that shelter right now is scrambling, trying to find homes for all these animals they had
Yes.
which were abandoned animals to begin with. That's why they were in the shelter.
Yeah.
And they're trying to find homes for them. And now they're trying to find homes again for them just to keep them alive and until they can get the shelter repaired and from the flooding and whatnot. So
Yeah.
that's just a small scale example of what, but
Right.
you know,
And yeah, and all of those animals have needs, and the other
yeah,
things people won't evacuate if they can't take their pets with them. So we need to make sure that our human shelters can accommodate pets as well. So we've got, this mix of animal rescue groups who are already, working with these animals, like you said, who need homes anyway,
yeah,
and then they're displaced again. So if it doesn't tug at your heart, go have a long conversation with yourself because that's entirely why I do what I do, is because the needs out there are just immense.
yeah,
And if I can do anything to ease suffering for a human, for an animal, I want to do it.
yeah, yeah. Great. So I got just a couple questions, kind of about what you guys do a little bit.
Yeah.
One question quickly here. What's the most common items or service that you're asked to move or supply?
Yeah. So we often get asked about moving hydration items like bottled water. So, in disaster, we're typically going to see power outages. We're typically going to see disruptions to community water systems. And it's also, it's easy for people to imagine, donating a bottle of water or a case of water. But we have moved just about everything imaginable, food, medical supplies, pet care, drywall, cleaning supplies, even hay. So back to our animal conversation, we've helped move hay before. And again, if we know that if it needs to get moved, there is somebody out there in the logistics world that can help do it.
Yep. And what are the things that you're most often in need of?
So I just talked about moving stuff. Transportation is by
The
far
biggest.
the biggest and the hardest to fill, which kind of surprises me sometimes when I think about, just the generosity of our community. And we know things just aren't aligning. But there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect. So if you're out there listening, you want to get involved and you're a transportation provider, please contact us. We're actively working on building out our network of transportation providers just so we can help our nonprofit partners better.
Is that dry van, flatbed, refrigerators, or I mean, is there a mix? Is it all?
There's a mix. I mentioned I mentioned flatbed. Dry van is the typical, hey, we want to move food and water and things like that.
Yeah.
Dry van is typically construction supplies. This is where people forget, hey, we've had a disaster 2 weeks ago. It's already out of the news cycle. But people are still trying to clean up their homes and, repair the damages. And that's where construction supplies have to move. And typically that stuff moves via flatbed.
Yeah.
And
And
surprisingly, sorry, just one more
no, that's
thing on
right.
that.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, there are a lot of nonprofit organizations out there who do home repairs, right? So it's not just the paid construction crews who can afford to go out and pay for that transportation. There are a lot of people who are uninsured or underinsured in their homes, and they rely on those nonprofits who come in and help them rebuild. So
Yeah.
we're
I know
hoping.
that there's always a spike in flatbed demand after
Yes.
disasters, which is the rebuilding portion of it. But
Yes.
yeah, but I
Yeah.
was curious about the actual in the time frame of when the immediate aftermath, if flatbeds are as much in demand.
Yeah.
Because I'm always
It's
curious, like I mean, we always see the dry vans lined up. I mean, we don't usually don't see many pictures of flatbeds often.
No,
Um,
dry van. And then for our partners who do like mass feeding operations where they set up cook sites,
mhm,
they'll need refrigerated, either trailers to park at the site to hold because they're typically set up in a parking lot somewhere, right?
yeah,
So they,
right.
they'll need the refrigerated trailers. But you're right, it is, a couple of weeks to months later, but those needs are still there.
Yeah. Um, we touched this and you just mentioned this asking, hey, get involved, right? Help out. So if companies are interested in getting involved, listening to this, how do they go about doing that? How would they What do
Yeah.
they need to know?
Yeah, what do they need to know? They need to know our website, allenaid.org, right? And what we really want them to know is we want companies to be involved in a way that's meaningful to them. And so we have a variety of ways to do that, right? Donate in-kind transportation, warehousing, material handling equipment, supplies, expertise, right? That's that's the easy button. Everybody has those things. It costs you very little to do that. We also need volunteers to help us, stay in touch with the nonprofit communities that are in the area where your business is. And then, I mentioned this earlier, as a nonprofit, we always need people who are willing to support our work with financial contributions. Again, visit our website, allenaid.org, and it will walk you through any and all of those things that you want to help with.
Yep. And you said you're a 501c, so those are non
That's right. Yeah, we're a 501(c)(3), so your donations are tax deductible, but check with your tax accountant because I am not a CPA, nor do I play one on TV. So, always check with your tax accountant. But if you are eligible to make tax deductible donations, we're a great.
then maybe
Yeah, exactly. And do it now before the storms roll in and you get busy and we get busy because, um, disruptions distract. And so we want to be able to have that conversation with you now about the best way
yeah.
to get you involved.
And final question for me, and that simply is the companies and the partners that you have that are involved. When a need arises, how do they find out about that? How's that communicated out to them? Is that emails out to them typically, or do you have other
Yeah.
ways that you communicate?
So it's we try to communicate the way that people want to be communicated with. So if you want to text, we'll text you. But typically we're posting that on our website, again, allenaid.org. We're posting on our social media platforms. If you search for American Logistics Aid Network, you'll find us. And then, on our, we'll also send emails. Whenever we have major events, we'll typically send an email blast that talks about ways for people to get involved, and we'll include a list of what's needed now.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. I'm so appreciative of you being here. We are out of time, and I want to thank you so much. To our audience, I do want to say that Alan does provide an invaluable service at a time when many lives depend on it. So on behalf of all the industry, Kathy, I want to thank you and your organization for what you guys do. And I want to encourage everyone listening today to reach out to Alan and get involved if you can. And it doesn't mean you have to be on the East Coast or the West Coast. Even the people in the middle of the country, there's needs that you never know where disaster is going to happen, and your help may be needed in that area of the country too. So get involved. Kathy, again, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Brian.
I want to thank my guest today, Kathy Fulton of the American Logistics Aid Network, and I want to thank each of you that took time to listen today. I greatly appreciate it. A new episode of Talking Supply Chain comes out each Thursday. You can find it on scmr.com or wherever you get your podcasts, so be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, this is Brian Straight, and you've been listening to Talking Supply Chain.